My name is Leonard Briggs. I'm 61 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life being the kind of man people forget is in the room. I wear plaid flannel shirts in winter and a plain gray tee in summer. I drive a 2009 GMC Sierra with a busted left mirror I keep meaning to fix. I mow my own lawn on Saturday mornings. I change my own oil. I built the back deck with my own hands the summer after my wife Ruth was diagnosed. Ruth died 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer. She was 58. The kind of death that comes fast and merciless, like a storm that doesn't announce itself until the windows are already shaking. We had 34 years together in Henderson, Nevada. Not the Henderson you picture when you think of Nevada. Not the Strip, not the neon, not the casinos. Henderson is a suburb of ordinary people, cinder block houses, HOA notices about lawn height, and neighbors who bring you casseroles when someone dies. Ruth and I had one child, our son Brandon. He's 34 now. He works in tech sales in San Francisco, and he married a woman named Celeste Ashford 2 years before Ruth passed. Celeste is 32. She has a master's degree from Northwestern, a Peloton she rides every morning at 5:15, and a talent for making you feel, in the most pleasant possible way, that you were standing slightly in the wrong room. I tried to love her because Brandon loved her. I tried hard. I'm a man who was raised to try hard at things that matter. My father was a union electrician in Reno who told me 3 things worth remembering. Show up on time, don't borrow what you can't repay, and never make a woman feel small in front of other people. I have tried to live by all 3. Not always perfectly, but I have tried. What I'm about to tell you started 6 months ago, the night of Brandon's company promotion dinner in San Francisco. I had driven up from Henderson, 14 hours, 2 tanks of gas, a thermos of black coffee, because my son had called and said, "Dad, I want you there," and that was enough. That has always been enough. What happened at that dinner changed everything I thought I knew about my son, about Celeste, and about a quiet piece of paper that Ruth had signed 3 years before she died, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad and James Orr, our estate attorney, while I was out back building the deck that was supposed to outlast us both. Like this video if you enjoyed the story. Comment your city below, and subscribe for more stories like this. The restaurant was in Soma, the kind of place where the menu has no prices, and the portions are the size of a Post-it note, artfully arranged on a plate that costs more than a week of groceries. I wore the only blazer I own, a navy one Ruth had picked out for me a decade ago that still fits because I haven't changed much. I drove myself from the hotel, a mid-range place 3 blocks from the restaurant, because Celeste had mentioned the valet situation would be complicated. Later I understood that what she meant was that she didn't want my truck out front. There were 20 people at the dinner. Brandon's colleagues, his boss, a trim, humorless man named Keith Dunbar, who shook my hand the way you shake the hand of someone you're passing in a hallway, and Celeste's parents, Lawrence and Vivian Ashford, who had flown in from Scottsdale. Lawrence was the retired CFO of a pharmaceutical company. Vivian wore jewelry that moved when she moved, and spoke with the practiced warmth of someone who had taken a course in speaking with practiced warmth. I was seated at the far end of the table, between a 28-year-old named Tyler who worked in Brandon's department and talked exclusively about growth metrics, and an empty chair that was supposed to be Celeste's college roommate, who had not come. I ate my 3-bite entree and I listened, and I was, as I always am, perfectly comfortable being the least important person in the room. Brandon gave a short speech. He thanked Keith. He thanked his team. He thanked Celeste, beautifully, with the kind of specific details that mean a man has been paying attention to his wife. He looked at me near the end and said, "And my dad, who drove up from Henderson, because that's who he is." There was polite applause. Lawrence Ashford clapped once, then checked his phone. After dinner, people moved to the bar area. I found Brandon near the window, a glass of bourbon in his hand, looking out at the city with an expression I couldn't quite name. I put my hand on his shoulder and he turned, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like he was 19 years old again and had something he needed to say. He opened his mouth. Celeste appeared at his elbow. "Brandon," she said, "Keith wants a photo with the team." And just like that, the moment closed. He smiled at me, apologetically, and was gone. I stood at the window for a while, looking at the city lights, thinking about the look on his face. I have been thinking about it ever since. I left San Francisco the next morning. I drove south on I-5, through the valley, with the windows cracked and the radio on a country station until the signal died somewhere past Bakersfield. I thought about Brandon's face. I thought about Celeste's hand on his elbow. I thought about the way Lawrence Ashford had clapped once and checked his phone. I called James Orr from the road. James has been my attorney for 22 years. He handled our first home purchase, our wills, our small business filings, when I ran a HVAC contracting company in Henderson for 11 years before I sold it. He is 70 years old and semi-retired, but for me he stays sharp. He picked up on the second ring. "Leonard," he said, "I've been expecting your call." Those words stopped me cold. I pulled into a gas station outside of Fresno and sat in the parking lot with the engine running. "What do you mean?" I said. "You've been expecting my call." "Ruth told me you'd call eventually," he said. "She said, when Leonard finally sees it clearly, he'll call." She was almost never wrong about these things. I sat with that for a moment. Ruth had been gone 3 years. She had, in those last months, said things that I had filed away under grief wisdom. The profound but shapeless things people say when they are near the end. I had not understood until that parking lot in Fresno that some of what she said had been specific, tactical, prepared. "She left a letter," James said. "I've had it in the rainy day folder since the week before she passed. She asked me to give it to you when you were ready. I'd say you're ready, Leonard." I drove to Reno instead of Henderson. James met me at his office, a second-floor suite above an insurance agency on Virginia Street, with good bookshelves and a coffee maker that he ran himself, which I always respected. He set the letter on the desk between us and smoothed it once with the flat of his palm. Ruth's handwriting was small and precise, the way she was about everything. She had written 4 pages. I will not tell you everything she said because some of it belongs to me alone, but I will tell you the part that matters to this story. She wrote, "Leonard, I have seen things in the last 2 years that I haven't been able to tell you without hurting you before I had to. I'm telling you now so you're not alone in it when it comes. Watch what they do with what you've built. Watch who benefits. Ask James to show you the trust document. The clause on page 7. I put it there for a reason. I love you. I always will. R." I turned to page 7. Ruth Evelyn Briggs had been, her whole life, the most organized person I have ever known. She kept a household ledger. She balanced every account to the cent on Sunday evenings. She read the fine print on everything, including the terms and conditions for our internet service provider, which she once actually called to dispute. She was meticulous in the way that brilliant, quiet people are meticulous. Not because they're anxious, but because they see the world with a kind of architectural clarity that most people don't. When she was diagnosed, the first thing she did, before she called her sister in Boise, before she told Brandon, before she sat me down at the kitchen table, was call James. She spent 6 weeks restructuring our estate. She told me she wanted to update the paperwork. I had said, "Of course, whatever you need." I had trusted her. That was, and remains, the right thing. The trust she created was called the Ruth Briggs Family Trust. It was funded with her half of our joint portfolio, the proceeds from the sale of a rental property we'd owned in Boulder City, and the equity stake she held in my old HVAC company. Equity I had transferred to her name in 2009 for tax purposes, and then simply left there because Ruth managed those things and I trusted her management. The total value of the trust, as of last month according to the statement James showed me, was $4.1 million. The income from the Boulder City sale and the reinvested dividends had done their work over 12 years. $4.1 million. I had known we were comfortable. I had not known the precise number. Ruth had managed the precise number, and she had managed it well, and she had left it inside a legal structure that I now understood was not just estate planning. It was armor. Page 7 contained what James called the protection clause. In the event that the primary beneficiary, me, was subjected to financial exploitation, intentional misrepresentation regarding assets or inheritance, or any coordinated action by a family member or their spouse designed to obtain control of trust assets, all trust holdings would transfer immediately to the contingent beneficiary. The contingent beneficiary was not Brandon. It was my niece, Melissa Hargrove, my younger brother Darrell's daughter, a 30-year-old elementary school teacher in Tucson, who drove a 10-year-old Subaru and sent me a birthday card every single year, without fail, always handwritten, always with a specific memory from when she was a kid. Ruth had loved Melissa. She'd always said Melissa had the heart of someone who chooses people over things. I set the trust document down. I looked at James. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then James opened the second folder. James had been building what he called a background file for 14 months. He had not told me. He had waited, the way Ruth had asked him to wait, until I was ready. He had retained a forensic accountant named Patricia Chi, and, separately, a licensed private investigator who operated out of Las Vegas, and whose name I will not use here, because some people deserve to keep their professional privacy. What they found was this. 11 months ago, Brandon and Celeste had begun meeting regularly with a financial advisor named Gordon Price, whose firm specialized in what their website called family wealth transition. Gordon Price had prepared a series of documents, 3 of which had been emailed to Brandon's personal account and forwarded from that account to Lawrence Ashford's email. The documents outlined a proposed strategy for what they described as proactive estate consolidation, a plan, in plain language, to move my assets into a jointly managed structure that Brandon and Celeste would co-administer. The plan assumed, without ever asking me, that I had approximately $2 to $3 million in accessible assets. It was wrong by a factor of 2, which was part of Ruth's design. The trust was structured to be invisible until James chose to make it visible. The second document was worse. It was a draft of a letter, never sent, from Celeste to a neurological care facility in Scottsdale, Lawrence's city, Lawrence's turf, making what she described as a preliminary inquiry about assisted living evaluation services for an aging family member. I am 61 years old. I run 4 miles 3 times a week. My doctor, Sandra Pena, at Desert Springs Medical, told me last spring that I have the blood work of a 50-year-old. The letter cited, as evidence of cognitive concern, my tendency to make financial decisions without consulting family, meaning my tendency to make my own decisions with my own money. The third document was an insurance policy, taken out 8 months ago in my name, through an online portal using digital credentials that matched a login from a device registered in Brandon's name. The policy was a $1.8 million term life policy. The beneficiary was Brandon Briggs. The premium had been paid from a joint checking account I held with Brandon, an account I had opened when he was in college for emergencies, which I had never closed because I had never thought I needed to. I looked at my hands in my lap. They were steady. I noticed that, and I was grateful for it. James said, "There's one more thing." He pressed play on a voice memo on his phone. It was from a dinner, Lawrence Ashford's voice, sharp and patrician, speaking to someone, Celeste, I think, from the rhythm of the exchange. He said, "The old man is sitting on more than he's letting on. The HVAC business alone, even sold, there's residual. And with Brandon on the accounts, it's just a question of patience and the right moment." Celeste's voice, flat and precise. "He's healthy, that's the problem. We need it to look like he came to the decision himself." "Patience," Lawrence said, "and the right kind of help." James pressed stop. I drove back to Henderson that night. I did not call Brandon. I did not call Celeste. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, and I looked at the photograph of Ruth on the shelf above the window, the one from our trip to Sedona the year before she was diagnosed, her arm around my shoulders, her face bright with desert light, laughing at something I had said that I no longer remember, but that had clearly been worth laughing at. I talked to her. I do that sometimes, when the house is quiet. I told her what James had shown me. I told her I wish she had told me herself while she was still here. But then I sat with it, and I understood why she hadn't. She had known with her architectural clarity that if I had known then, I would have confronted Brandon too soon without the full picture, and the full picture was what protected me. She had loved me by waiting. She had protected me by being patient. Even from wherever she was still the smartest person in the room. I called Sandra Pena in the morning and asked her to document my last 6 checkups in a formal summary with her professional assessment of my cognitive and physical health. She asked if everything was all right. I said I hoped so, and that I'd explain later. She had been my doctor for 11 years. She understood what I was asking without needing the whole story. I called James and told him to proceed. He knew what that meant. We had discussed it, in the abstract, over the course of the previous year, in the careful way that men who have known each other a long time discuss things that haven't happened yet, but that both parties suspect will. James closed the joint checking account. He removed Brandon's access to the estate planning portal I had set up after Ruth died. He contacted the insurance company and filed a fraud report regarding the unauthorized policy, with documentation of the device login and the account activity. He prepared a formal demand letter regarding the policy, with a copy of the forensic accountant's report attached. And then he called Gordon Price's firm and informed them that their client, Brandon Briggs, was no longer in a position to discuss any matters related to the Ruth Briggs family trust, as the protection clause on page 7 had been formally triggered. I imagine that was an interesting phone call to receive on a Thursday morning in San Francisco. The first call from Brandon came at 7:42 p.m. that same day. I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief, tight, controlled. "Dad, call me. We need to talk." 3 more calls in the next hour, each one shorter, each one tighter. Then a call from Celeste, which I did not answer. Then, at 10 p.m., a call from Lawrence Ashford, which I did not answer. Then silence. The silence lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, James called to tell me they had retained an attorney of their own, a woman named Harriet Voss, who worked family wealth litigation in the Bay Area, and that Harriet Voss had requested a meeting. James said he recommended we hold it in Reno, on neutral ground, in his conference room, with Sandra Pena and a corporate attorney named Frank Delgado present. They arrived on a Tuesday. Brandon in a pressed shirt that was slightly wrong, the collar too stiff, the way people dress when they are trying to look calm and have dressed for the version of themselves they wish they were. Celeste in a blazer, composed, the way marble is composed. Lawrence Ashford without Vivian, which told me something. Harriet Voss, professional, watchful. James was to my right, Sandra Pena to my left, Frank Delgado near the door. Brandon looked at me when he came in, not at the room, not at the folders on the table, at me. I held his gaze. His jaw was tight. He looked, underneath all of it, like he was afraid. Not of losing, of something else, of what he had become, I think, of the specific shape it had taken in the fluorescent light of a conference room in Reno. James opened the first folder. He walked them through the timeline. The meetings with Gordon Price. The forwarded emails to Lawrence. The draft letter to the care facility. The unauthorized insurance policy. The device login. The account access. The premium paid from my money. Harriet Voss said the emails were obtained through means her client had not authorized. Frank Delgado explained, with the same pleasant precision that attorneys deploy when they are winning and know it, that the emails had been forwarded from Brandon's own account, using Brandon's own credentials, to a non-privileged third party, and were therefore not protected. James played the recording of Lawrence Ashford's voice, patience, and the right kind of help. Lawrence's red face went a shade deeper, and then, remarkably, went pale. He said it was taken out of context. James said, in a tone I have loved him for across 22 years, "The context is on the recording, Mr. Ashford." Then James opened the second folder and explained the trust, the full value, the clause, the contingent beneficiary. Celeste said, "This will not hold." She said it the way she said most things, cleanly, without excessive emotion, from a position she believed was still defensible. James said, "You're welcome to challenge it." The challenge will require a full public accounting of the documents we've discussed, the insurance fraud referral, and the recording, all of which will enter the public record. The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had happened in that room. Brandon said, "Dad." His voice was nothing like the voice he'd used in the voicemails. It was the voice underneath. The one I had heard the last time when he was 17 and had wrecked my truck on a back road outside of Henderson, and had sat on the curb until I got there, not because he expected forgiveness, but because he could not face the wreckage alone. I looked at my son. He was 34 years old. He was wearing a shirt that was slightly wrong. He had made choices I could not forgive yet, but I knew that voice. Celeste and Lawrence left the conference room without speaking. Harriet Voss collected her materials with professional efficiency and followed. James and Sandra and Frank stepped out to give us privacy. Brandon and I were alone in the room with the fluorescent hum and the table between us and 34 years of everything that a father and son accumulate. He said, "I didn't know about the insurance policy, not what it really was." Celeste said it was a supplemental policy you wanted updated and that she needed my login to process the transfer. He stopped. He looked at the table. He said, I didn't ask enough questions. I said, no, you didn't. He said, the care facility letter. I didn't know about that either. He looked up. His eyes were red at the corners. I want you to know, I didn't know. I looked at my son. I believed him about the insurance policy. About the letter, I was less certain. But I understood that there is a difference between the things a person does themselves and the things they allow to happen around them without asking the questions that would force them to see clearly. Brandon had stopped asking questions. He had let Celeste and Lawrence build the architecture of a plan he was standing inside of without ever drawing the blueprints himself. That was its own kind of failure, a quieter one, but real. I said, your mother saw this coming before I did. She planned for it the way she planned for everything, carefully, without drama, because she loved you and she would not let her love for you blind her to what you were capable of when you stopped being yourself. His face changed. He had always loved Ruth differently than he loved me, with a softness that men sometimes reserve for mothers, the specific grief of losing the person who saw you most clearly and loved you anyway. I watched him feel the weight of her judgment and her grace at the same time. I told him about Melissa, about the trust transfer, about the contingent beneficiary clause his mother had written 4 years ago in the kitchen while I was out back building the deck. He pressed his hand flat on the table. He was quiet for a long time. He said, Aunt Ruth always liked Melissa. I said, she said Melissa chooses people over things. He nodded slowly. Then he said, is there any way back from this? And I told him the truth, which is the only thing worth telling at the end of a long day in a conference room when everything else has already been said. I said, I don't know yet. I said, what I know is that the debt is real. The accounts, the fraud referral, the work James and Frank and Sandra have done, all of that has consequences and you will face them. I said, but the door of my house is unlocked. The number is the same. When you've done what you need to do and you know who you are without Celeste deciding for you, I'll be in Henderson. He didn't say anything. He nodded once, the way men nod when words have stopped working and something else has to carry the weight. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I left him sitting at the conference table in Reno. 3 weeks later, I drove to Tucson. I had called James first and asked him to prepare a summary that I could share in plain language. A portion of it, the right portion, in the right order, the way you deliver news to someone who has not been waiting for it and deserves to receive it with care. Melissa teaches 2nd grade at an elementary school on the south side of Tucson. She drives, as I mentioned, a 10-year-old Subaru Forester with a faded bumper sticker from a 5K she ran in 2017. Her apartment is small, 2 bedrooms, and one of them she uses as a classroom overflow space. Boxes of books, art supplies, folders with students, names written in her handwriting. She had a cat named Walter who immediately climbed into my lap and refused to leave. She opened the door and looked at me with the same expression she'd had at Ruth's funeral. Open, warm, unguarded. Not performance, just herself. Uncle Leonard, she said, what are you doing in Tucson? I said, can I come in? We sat at her kitchen table, which had a watercolor painting drying on one end that one of her students had given her, she explained, because he said she looked like someone who would like flowers. She did look like someone who would like flowers. She looked like Ruth had always said she was, the kind of person who makes the room better without knowing they're doing it. I told her about the trust, not all at once, and the way you tell someone difficult, beautiful news, piece by piece, watching their face, making sure they're breathing. When I said the number, she went very still. She set down her coffee mug, she looked at Walter, Walter looked at her. She said, Uncle Leonard, that's not mine to have. That's Brandon's. I said, it isn't anymore. I told her the conditions Ruth had built into the document. I did not tell her about the recording or the insurance fraud. I told her that Brandon had made choices that had triggered the clause his mother had written, and that Ruth had known, even from her deathbed, maybe especially from her deathbed, that Melissa was the one who had her values, her groundedness, her understanding of what actually mattered. Melissa looked out the window for a while. Walter headbutted my hand and I scratched his ears. She said she called me every other week after she got sick, when everyone was focused on her, and she could have been focused entirely on herself. She still called to ask about my kids. She remembered their names, all of them. 23 kids, she remembered every single name. "That was Ruth," I said. My voice went quiet on it. Melissa reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. After a while, she said, "I don't know what to do with something like this. I'm a second-grade teacher in Tucson, Uncle Leonard. I eat leftovers for lunch, and I buy my jeans at Target." I said, "James will walk you through it. There's no rush." She said, "I just want to keep doing what I do." I said, "Ruth would have loved that answer." She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that doesn't cost anything. I drove home to Henderson that evening with the windows down and the desert cooling around me and the stars over Arizona, doing what stars do in the desert, which is refuse to be ignored. I have been back in Henderson for 3 weeks. The deck out back needs restaining before winter, and I've been doing it a section at a time in the mornings before the heat comes. The neighbor across the street, a retired firefighter named Gus, brings me coffee and we don't talk much. We watch the street wake up. It is the best part of the day. The fraud referral is proceeding. Gordon Price's firm has been notified by the State Financial Regulatory Board. Lawrence Ashford is under review by a separate agency regarding some earlier matters that James's investigation turned up. I will not go into detail because it is not my story to tell. Celeste has, I have been informed by Brandon, retained her own attorney. Brandon called 12 days after the meeting in Reno. Unknown number, which James had suggested I answer because Brandon had asked him to relay that he would be using it. I answered. He said, "Dad." He sounded like himself. Not the voice from the dinner, not the voice from the voicemails. The one underneath all of it. Tired and young and stripped of everything he'd been performing for 5 years. He said, "I moved out last week. I'm staying with Tom. Tom is his business partner. A decent man I've met twice." He said, "I filed for separation. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know I have a long way to go." I said, "Are you safe?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Are you eating?" He laughed, just a small sound, the kind of laugh that lives right next to tears. He said, "Tom's wife keeps leaving food in the refrigerator with sticky notes. She's a good person." I said, "Good people are worth keeping close." He was quiet. Then he said, "I keep thinking about what Mom would say." I said, "So do I, every day." He said, "I think she'd be disappointed in me." I thought about it. I said, "I think she'd be heartbroken and proud at the same time, and you know why." He didn't say anything. I said, "Call me this week, not about lawyers, not about money, just call." He said, "Okay." I said, "Good night, son." He said, "Dad." There was a pause on the line, the long kind, the kind that holds more than words can carry. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are. I know." I set the phone down. I sat on the deck Ruth never saw finished. The night sky over Henderson is different from the night sky over San Francisco. Wider, quieter, without the competition of city light. You can see the stars. I sat there for a while, and I thought about a man who spends his whole life being the quietest person in the room, and what it means when that quietness is finally the loudest thing anyone hears. I thought about Ruth at the kitchen table with James in a legal pad, building something that would outlast her worry and outlast her body and outlast even her own desire to be the one to protect me. I thought about what it means to be loved by someone who plans ahead. I thought I did all right. And then, because I could almost hear her voice saying it, dry and precise and entirely accurate, I thought, "Now go to bed, you look terrible." I went inside, I left the light on in the kitchen. I have been doing that since Ruth died, leaving one light on, because the dark of an empty house is its own kind of silence, and one warm light is enough to make the silence bearable. My phone sits on the counter. It rings sometimes, and sometimes now I answer it. What would you have done in my place? Was I too patient, too slow? Or is leaving the door open the only honest thing a father can do? Tell me what you think. Because if you've ever loved someone through their worst version of themselves, hoping for their best, you already know there's no clean answer. There's only what you decide to live with.